I'm the one who's in charge around here. Frosted glass panels, a pattern of melting stars. Body sliding down the door, vision obscured by a tangle of hair, too shocked for tears, having recently been airborne, propelled by the force of brotherly arms. She doesn't see his face, only hears him thump off, the full power of his 14-year-old bulk demonstrated on the floorboards. Dazed, trembling, fallen, she can hardly recall what she did to provoke him. Did she touch something of his without asking? Make some unsolicited comment about his weight? But what does it matter when that great form looms overhead, the bunched-up fists and the body mass twice yours? He's already gone away from her. She brushes the hair from her eyes, gathers herself up off the tiles. Presses her fingers against her back, feeling the damage. Not too bad this time. Sore tomorrow perhaps, but she'll bounce back. She's only just turned 11, flesh that is subtle, flexible and warm. It'll take more than a knock like this to twist her out of shape. No, it's not the physical hurt that bothers most, it's the powerlessness of it. Soaring through the air, just as if you were a plate, a piece of laundry, like there isn't any point in being human at all. She runs her fingers down the bridge of her nose, testing for a rupture. She knows from experience how it will open and stream red at the slightest provocation. Doesn't want it spilling on her shirt, besmirching the unblemished floor. Something wet is coming out, but it's only mucus, intermingled possibly with tears. Mushy whining sounds emanating from her nasal passage, wetness from her eyes. She's almost drooling. There's nothing wrong with her, not really. She hates the ease with which she has allowed herself to be dominated, as if she were made for it, this flaw, this shame, these tears. Later she will recount to her mother what happened, who sighs and says, "He's always hated that you were better at maths than him." This falls into the category of statements that are true but also totally unhelpful for fixing the problem which lies before her. The next evening they all go to visit Yanni's aunt. Her mother says, "Did I tell you about Yanni's brush with death yesterday?" Then they laugh and laugh. She is glad to be able to furnish them with some amusement. So, hello. I am S.L. Lim, the author of the passage which you just heard me read. From Revenge, a novel which you should also read. And so Revenge is a novel about what happens when you refuse to scale your desires to your circumstances. So Yanni is this person of great talent and great desire, and she's born poor and she has familial responsibilities and also a psychotically abusive family who are both very loving and in their respective ways manipulative and fucked up. And Yanni wants everything. She wants love and beauty and opportunity and art, and she gets none of it, and she wants to avenge that, which comprises the engine for the plot. So here I am talking about revenge, and it's a piece of fiction, and honestly, talking about a piece of fiction kind of feels like trying to describe what a piece of music smells like. I really think the best explanation for a piece of work is the work itself, and so I'd like to also talk here a little bit about my experience of how revenge has been received, which is, I think, a phenomenon which exists independently of the book itself. So we are gathered here today, dearly beloved, to celebrate women writers who write women's stories, which is a very powerful and a very valuable thing for us to be doing together. So embedded in this is a concept of representation, that elevating women writers is a stand-in or some necessary component of the elevation of women as a whole. And I think there's also a concept of authenticity in the work itself. So there's this idea that women are particularly placed to access certain truths about women's lives and the subjective experience of living those lives, which people who are not women are less likely to be able to access. And I think both these things are really important. So without making any claims on the talent or the lack thereof of any individual woman writer, a body of literature and a literary culture which women are excluded from is going to do worse as expressing, that reality and that subjectivity which I just described. And then I think on top of that, on top of these questions about the quality of the literary work, there's also a moral issue here. Women just have something at stake in how women's stories are told, which people who are not women don't have. And so there's this right to self-advocacy and a right to self-definition. I think, though, that we also have to think about the limitations of representation as a concept. So, all women's stories and all stories told by women aren't equally worthwhile of inclusion. There are bad books by women, and there are women with bad ideas. Representation for people of a particular identity is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for liberation for people of those identities. And so, for instance, we can look at someone like Pauline Hanson. She is not a feminist icon. We can look at someone like Penny Wong, co-signing the Labour parties, and Christina Keneally's racist and dog-whistling rhetoric about migrants. That is not a victory for queer Asian women. It's not a feminist victory for Jacinda Ardern to contribute $25 million to migrant boat turnbacks as part of her so-called well-being budget. So the elevation of women by itself is not enough. Linked to that, I would say that there's a difference between an identity and a politics. And that's a huge topic, but I would like to touch on it a little bit here. So one thing I would say about a lot of things which are described as identities, which carries this connotation of something which is intrinsic to the person who bears that identity, is that they are in fact externally imposed. And I think this is particularly true when we're talking about race. So being white, or race in general, is something which in fact has no consistent biologic definition. And it's a concept which arises historically in the context of colonialism, with the function of justifying the colonial extraction of power and of wealth. And it performs a similar function today. And so this is a really powerful insight, which comes from a field of study known as critical race theory, and which has recently come under attack, and its practitioners too have come under attack from Donald Trump, from Mark Latham in Australia, and other such intellectual giants who nonetheless have quite a bit of social and political power. This has been on my mind lately. I've noticed a trend in literary circles of authors such as myself being described as having intersectional identities. Take a moment for that plane to go overhead. Yes, so authors such as myself get described as having intersectional identities, and this is a little bit frustrating, in part because it's being used as a euphemism for not white, and in part because intersectionality as a concept, conceived by Kimberlé Crenshaw, a black feminist and critical race theorist, it's not about identity. It's a means rather of describing how multiple oppressions, and in particular anti-black racism and patriarchy, interact and produce a cumulative result which is different from each harm experienced in isolation, or even just the purely additive combination of those harms. So it's about understanding oppression, it's about developing practices to resist that oppression, and it's about gesturing towards the coalitions that we might form to resist those oppressions. So I think that this sort of interpretation of intersectionality as an identity is problematic in a few ways. And I'm not pointing fingers at any given person. I think that this is a process which is cumulative, which occurs across the culture, quote unquote, and yet it manifests itself in quite individualized ways, which are experienced by individual people, such as myself. So one thing I would say is that it's a problem to lift an idea from a radical body of work without seriously engaging with that body of work. I think it happens often when moderate, shall we say, thinkers or writers engage with radical thinkers. And I think it happens particularly often between black radicals and non-black thinkers. And I think It happens particularly often with Black feminist thinkers. And ultimately, no matter the intentions of the people engaging in this process, and I have certainly unintentionally engaged with it myself in various ways and at various times, it reflects a dynamic which is extractive. And so I will say here that, it is bad to substitute a concept of oppression with a concept of identity. And it's particularly bad in terms of race. Understanding racialization as oppression demands change on the part of the beneficiaries of that oppression. Whereas understanding race as identity puts the burden right back on racialized persons. And it allows, too, for a process whereby inviting a subset of authors who are not white, and in particular non-white authors who are not Black, into literary spaces doesn't necessarily change the underlying nature of those spaces. And so representation can become a substitute for serious engagement with anti-racist ideas. So I know that all of that is, quite heavy, and I'm, thank you for bearing with me to this point. A couple more things. These are scary times for radical scholars of race in the US and everywhere. In the context of the attacks on critical race theory I just mentioned, Kimberlé Crenshaw recently put out a message. She said, "I've often wondered what our allies would do when they came for us. Now we'll see." I think a lot of us need to hear this. And so just one more thing. I am not the same person as my novel's protagonist, Yanni. She is not an author surrogate, but one thing we have in common is that I have no intention of scaling my desires to my circumstances. So if that is a concept which vibes with you, please read my book. Thank you very much for listening.